Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to our Skillsoft Leader Camp, Overcoming Burnout in the Nearly Post-Pandemic Workplace. I am Shannon Lucky, Senior Manager of Leadership Content at Skillsoft, and I'm delighted to kick off this Leader Camp, the first in a two-day series around overcoming burnout and thriving in turbulent times. Today's session will address the 3 red flags of burnout, the differences between burnout, anxiety and depression, and how to heal from burnout, and the do's and don'ts of self-care when it comes to burnout. We have designed this Leader Camp to be a fully interactive and immersive experience. We do this by enabling the chat pod and Q&A functionality here in our virtual classroom. First, the chat. Please make sure that your chat function is set up for all panelists and all participants and join our global conversation. Now, if the chat flow thread becomes too distracting for you, you can minimize it by clicking on it and coming in and out of the conversation at will. If you have any technical questions or questions for our speaker directly, please send those to our team of facilitators via the Q&A functionality so that we can be as responsive to your requests as possible. Please note that this Leader Camp is pre-approved for professional credit for both HRCI and SHRM's recertification program. For more information, please send a message to us through Q&A as well. Now, I am delighted to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Ellen Hendrickson is a clinical psychologist who helps millions calm their anxiety and be their authentic selves. She serves on the faculty at Boston University's Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders and is the author of How to Be Yourself, Quiet Your Inner Critic and Rise Above Social Anxiety. Ellen's scientifically based, zero judgment approach has been featured in the New York Times, Harvard Business Review, The Observer, New York Magazine, the Oprah Magazine, Goop, Scientific American, Psychology Today, and many other media outlets. Ellen earned her PhD at UCLA and completed her training at Harvard Medical School. Ellen, as I hand the mic over to you, I would like to let our participants know that you will present for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then you and I, along with our esteemed facilitator, Nancy Santacesaria, will have a live Q&A session. So please send us your questions and we will be sure to address as many as possible. Thank you. And Ellen, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Shannon. And everybody who has joined us today, whatever time zone you are in, thank you so much for making the time to talk about burnout and overcoming burnout in the nearly post-pandemic workplace, because this has truly been a doozy of a year between work, remote schooling, increased housework at home from everybody being home, and having all of our supports knocked out from under us. Not to mention the fear, uncertainty, and quite possibly grief due to the virus. This was truly a year like no other. So we're here to talk about a specific slice of that at work. And so at work, I imagine many of you have felt like this. Fighting against forces beyond your control. Maybe you've even felt like the effort is futile. Or maybe you felt like this. Maybe you felt like the tasks keep coming and you just can't keep up. But I am here, along with Bill Murray, to tell you that you are not crazy. Burnout is absolutely real. And just the fact that you signed up for this webinar tells me that you resonate with that word in some way, that speaks to you at this moment in time. And I bet that you're in good company. So let's transition to a poll. I just want to take the temperature of everybody here. Oops. There we go. Now we're on the poll. So let's do the first poll question. So over the last year, the pandemic's lasted about a year, has your workload or have your job demands increased this year? And it looks like you guys are way ahead of me. We have our results, 82%. That's almost everyone. Fantastic. Next, poll question number 2. Have you struggled to balance your work and your life during the last year? I'll give you a few seconds to respond here. looks like we're closing in on around 83%. So also almost everybody. And finally, let's get to the heart of the matter. Have you felt burned out? Have you experienced burnout in this last year during this pandemic? I'll give you a minute to respond to that one. It looks like we're closing in also on 83%. So again, I sense a theme here, almost everybody. Okay. Now, this compares very much so to a poll that was taken by Harvard Business Review in the fall of 2020. So this happened in the middle of the pandemic. And the poll gathered feedback from more than 1,500 respondents in 46 countries, 2/3 of whom worked at or above a supervisor level. And there, 56% said that their work demands had increased. So our group here today responded that 82% found that their job demands had increased. So it makes sense. We layer 8 more months, several surges, a year of working at home and homeschooling. So it makes total sense that those numbers have now increased. Next, 55% in that same survey felt unable to balance home and work life, and 53% specifically cited homeschooling. Our poll numbers today show 83%. So the time has taken its toll. All these numbers make total sense, validate, relate. At the time of that poll, 62% of respondents said that they had experienced burnout often or extremely often in the previous 3 months. So again, 83% of us here today, makes total sense that those numbers have gone up. Glad you're here, you're in the right place. I didn't ask you this question, but during that poll, the respondents, 89% of the respondents said their work life was getting worse. So you can just think about that in your head and answer yourself. Okay, what are we going to talk about today? Well, lots of things. We've got a lot to cover. So first, we'll define burnout. We'll talk about the 3 red flags of burnout. How do you know if you're experiencing burnout? Why are we burned out? So there are 6 factors that lead us down that road to the end result of burnout. We will contrast burnout versus anxiety versus depression. These are close cousins that have a lot of overlap, but are in fact distinct things. So I'll help you differentiate what's going on in your life, if any of those things are happening. And we'll get into the heart of the matter, which is how to heal from burnout. And we will do that on both an institutional and an individual level. All right, so here's our roadmap. Let's walk our way through. So first, what is burnout? Let's define this. So burnout is a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. Now, this is the World Health Organization definition. And we use this because in the US, burnout is not recognized as a diagnosis. It is in Sweden. So perhaps we will all follow suit someday and make this a diagnosis. It also does make an appearance in the International Classification of Diseases, the ICD-10, and there it's defined as a state of vital exhaustion. But for now, in the US, we'll use this definition. And I want to point out 2 things about this definition. 1, this is a syndrome. So this is not one thing. These are several symptoms that hang together, and we'll go over that constellation of symptoms. But second is the more important thing, and that is the chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. So it doesn't say who is responsible for managing that stress. And I want to emphasize that this is not necessarily an individual problem. This is a workplace problem as well. And we will talk about both. So next, the 3 red flags of burnout. So how do you know if you're burned out? Well, let's start with exhaustion. This is feeling overextended and depleted by your work. And exhaustion has both physical and emotional components. So you might feel empty, like something vital has been drained out of you. You might feel unmotivated. It's really hard to get going, really hard to log on and start your work. You might perk up when you fantasize about quitting in a dramatic fashion. You might have what's called the Sunday scaries. You might dread logging on for work on Monday, and that can ruin your Sunday evening. In addition, like I said, to that emotional component, there's a physical component. You're always tired, no matter how much rest you get. And it can be a chore to peel yourself out of bed and log on. Next, mental distance is the second red flag of burnout. So mental distance is indifference, negativity, cynicism, or resentment towards your work. So this is where idealism has morphed into cynicism. Humor has mutated into sarcasm. And the people you work with or for, so whether that's your clients, your customers, or burnout began as a term for the medical field, it could be your patients, your teacher, it could be your students, this could also be your children. All these people that you work with and for start to seem like a burden. You used to feel for them, now you just resent them. So like I said, in healthcare, this is where burnout originated. The patient, Mrs. Smith, becomes instead the kidney in room 8. You might also think to yourself, like, no one appreciates what I do for them. Or like, what is with these people? Or just, idiots. Those are all signs that you may be on your way to some mental distance. Next, I love this slide. So next is reduced personal accomplishment. And this is exactly what it sounds like. It's low satisfaction with past and present accomplishments, and it is working harder and longer to get less done. So this is where burnout takes a toll on your actual work performance. And even if you can fake it, it takes a toll on your life. So here, it's hard to stay focused. You might feel sluggish. You might have brain fog. And forget about coming up with anything creative. You might feel lucky just to check your boxes, much less think outside them. Okay, those were the 3 red flags. Next, where does this come from? Why do we get burned out? It's not just one thing. And we will start with the research of Dr. Christina Maslach, who is the world's foremost expert on burnout. She's at the University of California, Berkeley, and she cites 6 factors. The first of which is unsustainable workload, or just in plain English, simply too much to do. So for example, way back in 2014, back in the Pleistocene, a study extrapolated that a quarter of Americans do at least some of their work between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. And that's a greater proportion than any other country in the analysis. So again, this was 2014. So layer on 7 more years, plus the pandemic, and I would be willing to bet that that percentage is way higher than a quarter at this point. Next, the second factor of burnout is perceived lack of control. And this is where you might feel like you have no agency or choice in your duties, process, or deadlines. So a really common example, just the tip of the iceberg, is feeling tethered to email or Slack or your phone, feeling that you have to answer your boss within minutes, regardless of when that email comes in. So remember that last slide, working between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. So I won't take a formal poll, but just in your head, think to yourself, how many of you check email, work email, before you get out of bed in the morning? I bet it's a lot of people. Next, the third factor is effort-reward imbalance, which is in short, working your butt off for little or no appreciation or feedback or reward. There's little payoff to your work, whether in terms of finances, prestige, positive feedback, you name it. So to illustrate, so in a 2010 study, Dr. Maslach, our burnout expert, examined effort reward imbalance in more than 900 Las Vegas hotel room cleaners. So there is a job with built-in effort reward imbalance, cleaning up after bachelor parties, bachelorette parties, who knows. And unsurprisingly, she found that the greater the imbalance, the more effort, the less the reward, the worse the cleaner's mental health, but also the worse their physical health. And when we think about it, that actually makes sense. Work is the biggest activity of your life. And so if you hate how you're spending the majority of your time and you feel like you're not getting any credit for it, your mind and body will let you know. But this is not something that just happens to hotel housekeeping or meter maids or Comcast service representatives. Anybody can suffer from effort reward imbalance, any profession, even stay-at-home parents. Next, our fourth factor is lack of a supportive environment. And in workplaces like this, instead of support and camaraderie from your coworkers, you get backstabbing and mean-spiritedness. So that defines itself. Next, fifth, we have lack of fairness, which essentially means injustice. And so that could relate to really big issues like institutional racism, lack of gender parity, harassment. Could be medium issues like whether or not the boss plays favorites, or it could be small things like in pre-pandemic times when we were all in the office. It could be like, hey, why does the new guy get an office with a window? That's not fair. Sorry, my slides are freaking out. Okay, here we go. And the last factor is mismatched values and skills. And so this is when you feel like you're working against your conscience or your morals. And that doesn't have to be egregious. It doesn't have to be like you're evicting old ladies or you're harpooning baby whales. It could be that you just feel like you're working for a corrupt purpose, or you feel like you're working for the equivalent of an evil empire, hence this slide. Okay, those are our 6 factors. So now let's pivot and differentiate burnout from anxiety and depression. Again, these are all really close cousins that get mistaken for one another. So here's our Venn diagram. Burnout, anxiety, depression, common factors, but this is my tomato Venn diagram. They may seem like tomato. They may seem like very similar things, but really they're quite distinct. And they're more like apples and oranges. And you get a bonus banana in there because we have 3 things. So let's talk about how they are, in fact, different. And I'll give you the world's fastest primer on major classifications of mental health problems here. Okay, anxiety. Anxiety has 2 hallmarks. One is worry that feels uncontrollable. Whatever your worry, whatever that is for you, whether it's social, general, OCD, something like that. When you're worrying, you cannot keep those worried thoughts out of your mind. They're like a mental screensaver. Whenever you're not actively engaged in something else, there they are. And physical tension. You might carry anxiety in your jaw, your neck, your back, your GI system. I'm sure you know where you hold your anxiety. Now, anxiety can actually be useful. Subclinical anxiety. Anxiety is an evolutionary process. We scan the horizon for threat. We look for the things that we need to plan for. We look for those what ifs, and then we can get on top of them and prevent bad things from happening. But when to mix my metaphors, when our burglar alarm is set a little too sensitively, then we end up scanning a little too intently, going to those worst case scenarios and over focusing on them. And we end up believing the 2 lies of anxiety. The first of which is the worst case scenario is bound to happen. The worst case scenario is a foregone conclusion. If I can think of it, if my anxiety can think of it, that's what's going to happen. The second lie of anxiety is I can't handle it. I can't deal with the blips and bloops and things that life throws at me, and therefore I have to avoid them. So that is our primer on anxiety. What often will happen is that anxiety can, not always, but sometimes, be the tadpole to the frog of depression. So perhaps what started as anxiety about the pandemic, anxiety about the state of the world, anxiety around work, that can morph into depression if two things are met. Helplessness and hopelessness are the two hallmarks of depression. So helplessness at the ability to change things, hopelessness, things will never get better. And then we end up with something that looks more like depression. Okay, but now let's differentiate burnout and depression. There are a lot of overlaps here. Exhaustion, feeling low, maybe feeling irritable, reduced performance. Those are part of that overlap of that Venn diagram of burnout and depression. But depression has several factors that it doesn't share with burnout. So this is kind of an old-fashioned term, but low self-esteem, essentially feeling like something is wrong with you. In burnout, it's more like what's wrong with everybody else. But in depression, it's feeling inadequate, incompetent, worthless, something like that. In depression, there are, like we said, feelings of hopelessness. Things will never get better. And of course, in depression, there can be, not always, but there can be suicidal thoughts or thoughts of hurting yourself. Those don't happen in burnout. More importantly, burnout is distinct, as illustrated by this slide, is that it's constrained to the domain of work. So with burnout, that little black rain cloud stays squarely over your workstation. Whereas in depression, it follows you everywhere. So in other words, individuals who are depressed will still be depressed sitting on a tropical beach, but people with burnout will often feel better once they've taken some time off and are surrounded not by demanding customers, but by whatever they need, by palm trees or a stack of novels or their woodworking tools, whatever floats their boat. Now, what does this mean for the pandemic? So if you feel like you're burned out on the pandemic, when the situation starts to change, so maybe this summer, maybe even sooner, we'll see, this is a moving target, you're still feeling exhausted, you still have lower productivity. As the situation has changed around you, then that may be a red flag for depression. Okay, a question I get a lot is, do I have a problem? Or does my loved one have a problem? How do I know if I or someone I love is suffering from burnout, anxiety, depression to the point where they have a problem or professional help might be appropriate? So there are two filters to put that question through. And the first is distress. Essentially, am I suffering? Is my loved one suffering? This is beyond regular workaday stress. It's tipped over into something bigger. You might feel miserable. For women, it often manifests as feeling guilty or worthless. For men, it often manifests as feeling angry or irritable, but any gender can feel distress that crosses that threshold, and it still counts. You don't have to fit a profile. So you might ask yourself, hey, Nick, I notice I'm crying in the shower every morning. I'm really snapping at my partner. Or I have the urge to primal scream when I log off from staff meeting because I just can't take it anymore. If that is beyond your regular workaday, that might qualify as distress. Next is impairment. You're stuck. And with impairment, it means that anxiety, depression, burnout, one or all of those, is keeping you from living the life you want to live. So for example, maybe you're missing deadlines. Maybe you feel unable to contribute in meetings, either because you're burned out or you're anxious. Maybe you're drinking to deal with work stress, and that's impairing your relationship. So if you've reached that distress or impairment threshold, then you might consider reaching out, thinking about whether you need to take some steps. In other words, or through another lens, the simplest way to answer if you have a problem is to ask if anxiety, depression, burnout is causing problems in your life. If the answer is yes, then again, one of your options is to seek some help. Okay, I've thrown a lot at you, and now we can get into the meat of it. So lots of information today. How to heal from burnout. So I wish the proportions on this were a little bit different. I wish the individual pie was a little bit bigger just to make people feel more empowered. But to get your fire burning brightly again after burnout, there are two main pieces to this pie. So again, the proportions here might not be exactly to scale. But the take home is that burnout is, at its heart, primarily a workplace problem. We can't expect individual solutions to fix institutional or policy problems. So matcha tea is not going to compensate for an unsustainable workload. But by the same token, it's not like you can't do anything. There are indeed individual things you can do. And we'll talk about both. Okay, so let's start with workplace solutions. If you're a manager listening to this and you have some control over how you run your team, you might think about what you have control over in confronting these 6 factors of burnout that we've talked about and how to change things for your own team. Okay. First, the opposite of an unsustainable workload is a sustainable workload. So we're going to work our way through these 6 points of Dr. Maslach's one by one and talk about some potential solutions. So asterisk, I'm not Adam Grant. I'm not an organizational psychologist, but I can at least scratch the surface for you about possible solutions, and we can all get creative and think with our teams about what would apply to your workplace situation. So let's go back to that example about those quarter of Americans, probably more now, who work between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. Meetings are often cited as an impediment to doing one's actual work, and one's actual work will often get done before or after work hours. Now, during the pandemic, time in meetings has increased by 13%. Not helpful. So teams might consider trying to stick to core meeting hours, perhaps having meetings only between 10 and 3 or 12 and 4, or having meetingless, that's the slide, days or weeks. Maybe you have meetingless Friday, or once a quarter you have a meetingless week. In addition, when you do have meetings, think about having shorter meetings. Meetings don't have to be an hour. You can think about making them shorter or more targeted, especially in the age of video calls, which sap energy. And I could go on a tangent about that, but I won't. If you have questions about why video calls are so hard, we can talk about that in the Q&A. Okay. Now, as a tangent, I realize we're talking about organizational level things right now that you can do to change things, but I want to say an individual thing that you can do to create a more sustainable workload is to delegate. And by delegate, I don't mean dump the things that you don't like on the intern. Instead, this is an internal form of delegation. Fight that feeling that you're the only one who can handle things. Because folks who do well in their jobs often have a sense of over-responsibility. If you think you want something done right, you have to do it yourself. Folks with over-responsibility are more vulnerable to burnout. So the answer is not a 180. We're not going to have you flip from being overly responsible to being irresponsible, but we can dial it back to simply being responsible. And road testing, letting others spread their wings on some tasks where something's in it for them, they can be helpful to you, but also grow their own careers. Road test that and see what happens. All right, that was my tangent. I'm bringing you back. Okay, next, perceived control is the opposite of perceived lack of control. Now, post-pandemic, as we move into the new normal, whatever that's going to be, that might mean greater work from home versus in office versus hybrid flexibility. Again, this might mean being available for core hours, but otherwise free to do the work at times that suit you. And like we talked about before, in terms of perceived control, it's making crystal clear availability expectations. Those, like, when am I supposed to get back to you on email, Slack, etc. So talk to both your team and your boss about those expectations. I have worked with so many people who reflexively respond to emails as soon as they come in. I've had more than one client who checks email from bed. I had another client who, when she was away from her desk to let the dog out, in those 2 minutes, she would take her phone with her so she could check her email as she let the dog out during those 2 minutes. But before they started to make some changes around that, they'd never actually talked to their bosses about what was necessary. So do talk about it, do raise that conversation. Because maybe during certain crunch times, it is necessary to be tethered to your phone. That makes sense. It's, but it doesn't have to be 110% all the time. Maybe other times, email or Slack messages can wait until business hours, or maybe your boss will tell you that if he or she really needs you, he or she will text or call you. Okay. Next. The opposite of effort-reward imbalance is regular recognition of both the team and individuals. And that recognition can take many forms. It can be financial, it can be social, it could be official, literally a plaque or something like that, or it can be unofficial. It could be simply talking them up in a meeting, giving props. Now, one thing to keep in mind is to praise the team publicly and to praise individuals, sometimes publicly, but most often privately. Because there's this caveat that praising individuals publicly can possibly stoke resentment. If you praise somebody for going the extra mile, maybe somebody else in the team says, hey, I went the extra mile too. So praise the team publicly, default to praising individuals privately. All right. Number 4 is lack of a supportive community, the opposite of which is facilitation of supportive community. And through one lens, this essentially means deal with the jerks. You might have heard of Robert Sutton's book, the 2007 workplace classic, and it's called The No Asshole Rule. And the premise is that employees with malicious intents or negative attitudes not only make work unpleasant, but they actually hinder an entire organization's success. So to facilitate a supportive community, take complaints seriously, keep an eye out for microaggressions or not so microaggressions that make a workplace feel unsafe. And the best thing you can do overall is to listen, empathize, and take action. 5th, the opposite of lack of fairness is transparency and communication. So this speaks for itself. Transparency and communication, even about bad news, even about tough issues, and I would actually say especially about bad news, especially about tough issues, build trust and respect. And finally, the opposite of mismatched values and skills is clear meaning and purpose. Why are you doing what you're doing? Sometimes that's easy. Sometimes if you work for a medical company, you might bring in somebody who is struggling with that illness for a Q&A. It gives people a human connection. Sometimes it's more abstract. Sometimes you have to think about how you're making people's lives better or easier or more efficient. You're addressing a pain point, but sometimes it's also personal. Maybe you're on a stepping stone to something bigger. Maybe you're learning new skills. And sometimes it's as simple as you are providing for your family and modeling a job well done. So what is your meaning and purpose? All in all, at the end of all these 6 things, the opposite of job burnout is this umbrella of job engagement. So imagine what it would take for you to be engaged in your job. Better yet, put your heads together with your team. What do you want this to look like? What do you envision in a great place to work? Okay, that's the workplace side of things. So now let's do the individual side. Now, originally, self-care had a medical connotation. This was developed actually as a medical word. It was taking on one's own low-risk medical care, like giving yourself insulin or learning how to use an EpiPen, doing physical therapy at home, all of which freed up healthcare workers for work that can only be done in the hospital, in the office, etc. Self-care. But it's evolved, and today we think about it more as replenishing your battery. Think about burnout as draining your battery. You deliberately have to replenish your battery. And healthcare professionals who specialize in burnout talk about their shorthand is E+ and E-. E-, energy minus, those are the things that drain your energy. E+ are the things you deliberately have to do and to prioritize in order to recharge that battery. Okay, my big asterisk with this, a disclaimer, is not to try to treat an anxiety disorder or depression with a bubble bath or a meditation app. And don't let self-care culture convince you that you should try to do that. That's different. That said, let's think about some do's and don'ts of self-care. And we'll start with the don'ts. I'll get the negatives out of the way first. So first, don't think of self-care as a to-do list item. I have a couple of things to say about that. So first, self-care often gets sold as specific behaviors. It often gets sold as maybe disciplined behaviors, healthy behaviors like journaling or yoga or meditation or working out or eating healthy. But it also gets sold as luxurious or indulgent behaviors, like getting a manicure or skipping your workout or mainlining your kids' Easter candy after they go to bed. Hashtag self-care. Now, none of these activities are wrong or bad. They all have their place. But it does beg the question, if self-care can be anything, it can be working out or skipping your workout, it can be eating healthy, it can be eating unhealthy. If it can be anything, what exactly is it? And so I'd like to try to shift your perspective. Rather than thinking about self-care as a specific behavior, I'd like you to think about self-care as more about paying attention. It's about being attentive enough to know what you need, which may be different on different days. So, some days you might need to go do your workout or eat healthy. Some days you might need to skip it or whatnot. So think about what you do when you take care of someone else. A sick child, your partner's going through a tough week. When you take care of them, you keep an eye on them and you provide them with what they need. So self-care is similar. Keeping an eye on yourself and providing yourself with what you need. And that might be a standalone activity like meditation or a trail run or whatever. Or it may be more nebulous. It may be setting some boundaries with your nosy sister. It may be having a talk with your boss about those email availability expectations. But at heart, self-care is not, again, a to-do list specific behavior. It's a mindset. Self-care is a commitment to take care of yourself. So to ask yourself, like, what would make my life better right now? And what do I and the others around me, which I'll talk about in the next point, what do we need right now? It's keeping an eye on yourself, taking care of yourself. Next, don't isolate. Self-care doesn't have to be by yourself. Me time doesn't have to be just me time. Self-care can be private. It can be the classics of meditation or a bubble bath, but it can also be with others. Now, when I work with clients who have depression or burnout, one of the first things I'll have them do is track their daily activities. I'll have them track it for at least a week. And I'll have them rate their mood along with each activity. And what we're doing is we're looking for patterns. And we're looking for information and evidence and how they can do more of the things that make them feel better and fewer of the things that make them feel depressed or burned out. So over many people, consistently, people's moods are lowest when they're alone and in front of a screen. They're highest when they're with others, being social, and or outdoors. And so don't think you have to be alone with a face mask, to do self-care. There is absolutely a place for that. Our battery can recharge that way, but it often recharges when we're with others. So that could mean family movie night. That could mean listening to your wedding playlist while you and your partner clean up dinner. It could be going for a walk with your neighbor, FaceTiming with your college friends while you fold laundry. There are 80 zillion ways to recharge your battery with other people. And our final don't is don't wait until the time is right. There's never a good time. It's never convenient. So especially if you're feeling burned out, you might not feel like doing anything but sit on the couch and watch Netflix. And I totally get that. Validate, relate. But we can't wait to feel like doing something before we do it if we're burned out, because we're exhausted. And so of course we're not going to feel like going on a walk with our friend. Or of course we're not going to feel like going to the dog park with our dog. Or of course we're not going to feel like sitting down and playing piano. And so let's reverse that. Rather than waiting to feel like doing something before we do it, let's put action first. Let's put action before motivation, put action before mood, and we can flip the script. So rather than waiting to feel like going for a run, we can lace up our shoes and head out the door, and probably our mood will catch up. Probably we'll be glad we did it. Worst case scenario, you hate it every minute, you still went for a run. You might sit down at the piano even if you don't feel like it. Start playing Rhapsody in Blue, and then inspiration finds you. Now, don't use this technique to force yourself to do stuff you hate. Like don't start doing your taxes and expect your mood to catch up and be happy. But if you have enjoyed something before, or it usually makes you feel better or more connected, then you can go ahead and put action before mood, action before motivation, and your mood or motivation will likely catch up. All right, let's move on to our do's. So 3 do's. First, start with your body. Psychologists specializing in burnout start here. So things like, yeah, how much wine are you drinking? What is going on with exercising? Maybe it's time to Google what to do about that knot in your back. When was the last time you ate lunch? Not staring at your computer. Again, that term self-care started as a medical concept. So it is natural that the foundation of taking care of yourself is taking care of your body. Start with your body, the rest can follow. Number 2, do take your vacation days. This is deceptively simple. This is actually way harder than it sounds. And we, Americans at least, leave so many vacation days on the table. So in a 2016 survey from NPR, Harvard, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, 49% of American workers, so just about half, said they can't vacation because their workloads are too heavy. And 42% of those same survey respondents said they couldn't take all their vacation days because there weren't enough people to cover for them. That can absolutely be true. Sometimes that is not a distortion. It is totally hard to clear your schedule. There's so much work waiting for you when you get back. I get it. At the same time, I've worked with many clients who won't take time off because they fear their team won't need them. And then that means they have no value. Or they worry that if someone else can do their job, people will realize they're not necessary. There are many barriers to taking your vacation time that are not workload. But employees who do take vacations are shown to have better performance reports, to have lower turnover rates than those who don't. Plus, vacations allow you to come back refreshed with different perspective, and no one can ever take those experiences away from you, whether it's a vacation, a staycation, anything in between. And our final do is think of self-care as care rather than improvement. Self-care doesn't have to have a larger goal than just that, taking care of yourself. You don't have to come out the other side of self-care in better shape. You don't have to know a new language. You don't even have to feel blissed out. Self-improvement absolutely has its place. But self-care is about paying attention, providing yourself what you need, and showing yourself TLC rather than looking for how you can do things better. That's self-improvement. All right, we've covered a ton today. We've covered the definition. We've covered the 3 factors of burnout. We've covered the 6 things that go into burnout. We've covered the difference between anxiety, depression, and burnout. And we've talked about how to heal from those things both on an institutional level and an individual level. So we have a good 15 minutes for questions, which is my favorite part. So let's think about that.
Thank you, Ellen. And yes, I can confirm that we have a number of questions coming in. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So the first question we have here is, whenever I try to do self-care, I end up feeling like I should be spending time with my kids instead. I should be getting stuff done, etc. How can I take care of myself without feeling guilty?
Absolutely. I'm so glad that question got asked. So how can I take care of myself without feeling guilty? All right. So guilt is an emotion for when we've done something wrong. And I want to emphasize that your emotions are always valid. What you feel is always valid. However, sometimes the thoughts and interpretations that lead to that emotion, maybe we can push back on those. So are you doing something wrong when you take care of yourself? So oftentimes in our culture tells certain people that they don't deserve to be taken care of, or that your role is to take care of others, not take care of yourself. So to push back on that idea, push back on that thought that is giving rise to that. So that's one way. A backdoor workaround to that guilt is that remember when we went on planes? The whole
Yes.
Put your oxygen mask on first. So as a child, I remember not understanding that and thinking like, that doesn't, why would you help me first? And, only as an adult did I realize like, oh, that's so the adult doesn't pass out before they can help the child. And so the same adage applies. If you can't manage to think about taking care of yourself for yourself, that feels selfish to you or you feel guilty about it, think about it as sustaining yourself so you can take care of other people, whatever works for your brain.
That's a great perspective to apply and a great example to highlight, caring for yourself first before you can so you can adequately care for others. So is there another way, or should we toss it over to Nancy to highlight another question?
Thanks, Shannon. First of all, everyone, thank you so much for all of the great questions you've been submitting. We've been collecting them. Ellen, I see a theme around a question here, but I'd like to see if you might be able to respond. It has to do with how do we let our bosses know that we're struggling without it negatively impacting us? Or listed another way, how do we let them know without it sounding like we're complaining?
Totally. So one way that I have, advice I can give is to go to your boss with both the problem and a potential solution. So to not just say, hey, like, I'm going to dump this in your lap, do something about this, but to say like, hey, this has been a problem for me, or this is a problem for the team, and here's something I think we can do to help solve it, or here's something I'm willing to try, experiment with, etc. And that way your boss doesn't feel dumped on. Instead, they're probably more likely to listen to you and to try the thing that you suggest, which can be what the outcome that you would like to happen.
Very good, thank you.
That's great, thank you. And I have a question here that I'd like to highlight, because I know I am guilty of this myself, is I worry about how I can set an example for my kids if I cannot control myself around my screen time, right? So to highlight that example where you talked about the woman would take her dog outside and she'd take her phone with her, what are some ways that I can sort of change my mindset, my approach, so I can ultimately set a good example for my children, and also sort of try to overcome some of the anxiety about always being available, always being on, that this sort of pandemic may be created by moving everybody to a remote setting?
There's so much in there.
I know.
Great question, many layers. Okay, so first, let's talk about setting a good example. Sometimes our kids will look at us and they'll just see us staring at the screen, or and they have no idea what we're doing. And so sometimes it can be helpful to narrate what you're not word for word, but like, so they're like, I'm looking at for the direct, how do I get to that place? Or like, I have my boss has a question, like I'm going to answer that question. So like, they don't just see the optics of you not paying attention to them. They know you're doing something. And so you can say, that's one thing to do. And then the deeper solution is to to try to put the phone down, and that to see what is the anxiety, what is that perceived worst case scenario, what is that, you know, feared outcome that you think is on the horizon, and then to push back on that. Has that ever happened before? Like, maybe it has, you know, and then like, sure, you should absolutely keep doing that. But if it's never happened, if like you're worried that if you're off email, you're going to get fired. Does that happen in your organization? What would have to happen to get to that point? Would you get a warning? Would you get a, you know, would you have a conversation with your boss? Would it come out of the blue like that? And so to really push back on those very loud, you know, anxiety voices, and to try to ask, like, really, what are the odds? Or like, or if you're worried about it, maybe something like your boss will be disgruntled for a few minutes. How bad is that? Is that a catastrophe? Will everybody live? You know, will you keep your job? So to either decatastrophize or think about the actual odds of the situation your anxiety is forecasting, and to try to push back on that in order to put down your phone.
That's a lot of great advice.
There were a lot of layers there. Did I get
Yes, there were a lot of layers, and I think you hit on a number of great points that I myself will plan to put into practice, because you know, that question really speaks to what I deal with on a daily basis.
Validate, relate.
Nancy, are there any questions that you're seeing in the chat that we might want to highlight for Ellen?
Thanks, Shannon. Yes, actually, I am seeing another theme having to do with the idea that, so now we've come to a point where we're able to get over burnout ourselves, but how do we help those who are always negative about everything else? And how do we keep them from impacting us and impacting our mood?
Yeah, no, a bad mood is contagious. It's depressing to be around depressed people. It's, you know, it puts us on edge to be around anxious folks. You know, I don't want to stigmatize any of that, but yeah, it can be contagious. So how do we help those people? Well, sometimes we can't, and sometimes we can be there. Okay, we can't save anybody, right? We're not going to rescue anybody. We can try to be their champion if we are getting a lot of negative vibes, you know, really just down and hopeless attitude. We can try to talk it out with them. You know, you can try to offer your support, but at the end of the day, you can't change people. They can only change themselves. And I know that can be hard for either if you have to work very closely with them, or, you know, otherwise feel responsible for them. But at the end of the day, you can set some limits, you can take care of yourself, you can offer help, but we can't change anybody else. It has to come from within.
Great, thank you.
And I think as a follow-up question to that, you know, I'm wondering if you could highlight a few resources for our learners, especially not even if they're trying to help somebody, but even just working on their own themselves, whether it's you reference Robert Sutton's book, or are there any other resources you could point them to dig a bit deeper and really sort of understand burnout. I did see a question come in around the idea of how do you differentiate between burnout and procrastination, right? You know, we may be just labeling it as burnout when maybe we are just procrastinating from doing the tasks that we just no longer like doing. How can you sort of, so two parts, are there any resources that we can then point our learners to dig a bit deeper? And also, is there a way to help us understand how procrastination and burnout differs?
Sure, absolutely. So in terms of resources, so if you want to go through your company, most companies have employee assistance programs that can help you either find a therapist or otherwise support you. If you don't want to go through your company, certainly there's a whole wealth of information. If you're looking for someone, a mental health care professional, fantastic resources, the Psychology Today Find a Therapist database. You can sort by insurance and zip code and specialty. So that's a way to find somebody if you want to talk to somebody. Most people are doing online therapy. So, you know, like the catchment areas you don't have to be within a 10-minute drive anymore. You can
Mhm.
be on the opposite end of the state. I've worked with people in Western Mass, during this, and I live in Massachusetts and I'm licensed in Massachusetts. I worked with people on the opposite end of the state during the pandemic because of telehealth. So, okay. I won't try to list a million books,
Mhm.
but your local library, any place you might find some bibliotherapy is always a good place to start.
Great.
Okay, procrastination. Great question. Procrastination, is usually a sign of anxiety. And if I was going to do, we could also do this presentation again and put another bubble in there of perfectionism. And so procrastination often comes from feeling overwhelmed and then getting paralyzed, or feeling like we're never going to reach the standards that we've either set for ourselves or we perceive that others have set for us. So why even try? It's kind of kicking the can down the road because we don't know where to start, or we think we're not going to do it right. We're going to make a mistake. So with procrastination, I would say build in the expectation of screwing up at the beginning. If you've never done this task before, or it's a monumental task, like there's going to be some experimentation at the beginning. You can write, throw spaghetti at wall on your to-do list. You can just build in time for like, oh, that didn't work. Whoops, got it. Maybe I'll try it this way. Or build in time for learning how to do it. And when we build in the expectation of screwing up or making a mistake or having to do that part over or learn, then it becomes more realistic. Also, we can question those standards that we've set for ourselves or that we perceive others have for us. And it's not necessarily the high standards that get in your way. Those actually get you a long way. It's when standards are rigid and arbitrary. So I have to reach like this level, or else. I have to do it on the first time. That's rigid. And if you do not expect anyone else to reach those same standards, if it only applies to you, then it's arbitrary. And so try of more flexible, egalitarian standards. And like, again, keep those high standards, but make them flexible and make them apply to anyone, not just you. And that might free you up to get started on that work.
Great advice, and something I will definitely put into practice. Nancy, I think we have time for about one more question. Is there anything that you want to highlight from the chat that we're seeing?
Thanks, Shannon. Sure. Alan, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how managers can spot burnout in their employees, what things to look for, and what they might do as a first line of defense.
Yeah, so spotting burnout can be hard because people are often good at hiding it. Nobody wants to, show to their manager that they're burned out, but you can sometimes get little clues. If you ask the standard, like, oh, even if it's just the small talk, like, how are you? And you get, okay, or hang it in there, so if there's some boiling water happening, under there, you're gonna see some steam vents. You're gonna get little indications that things are not as they should be. And so to establish yourself as a safe person to talk to, establish yourself as the champion of the employee. You want what's best for them. They're a valuable team member. And if they're struggling, like, that's not a weakness. You want to know how you can help, how you can support them. So just it's going to be subtle. You might have to look for those little steam vents, or you can ask everybody directly. You cannot have to wait and just check in with your members individually. Of course, don't do this in a public setting, but how are you doing? I know you have what's going on. Like, are you okay? How can I help you? And to create the opportunities so they don't have to either passively tell you or just keep it under wraps. So to ask, and they will respect your honesty and your care.
Great, thank you. I think those are excellent tips for managers who are trying to head this off in their own organization. So thanks, Shannon.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you, Ellen. We are just about at the top of our hour. So I'd like to thank all of our participants for your active engagement in today's Leader Camp. You will see in the chat pod that we've included a link to our survey. We would like to gather your feedback on this experience. And on behalf of the entire Skillsoft organization, thank you.